I knew the HOA was bad news the moment I moved in, but I never expected them to come after my horses. My name's Danielle, and I own a small horse stable on my property. Well, I did until the HOA president, Karren decided she had a personal vendetta against me. She was the kind of woman who lived for control, wearing her ridiculous beige power suits like she was the queen of the neighborhood. The worst part, she didn't even own her home she rented, but somehow she still managed to get herself elected as HOA president. For the first year, I managed to stay off her radar. I kept my property in perfect condition, paid my dues on time, even though I hated every penny going into that HOA fund and minded my own business. But the moment Karren found out I had horses, oh, it was like she smelled fresh blood in the water. She showed up on my doorstep one morning, clipboard in hand, her signature fake smile plastered across her face. "Danielle, we need to talk about your situation." I crossed my arms, already dreading whatever nonsense she had cooked up. My situation. She waved a manicured hand toward my backyard, where my two horses, Jasper and Lady, were lazily munching on hay in their enclosed stable. "This neighborhood has standards, and unfortunately your livestock doesn't meet them." "They're not livestock, they're my horses, and I have permits for them." Karren's smile tightened. "HOA regulations override city permits. We've recently updated our bylaws, and unfortunately, your stable is now in violation. You have 30 days to remove it, or you'll start accumulating daily fines." I stared at her, barely believing what I was hearing. "You can't just change the rules out of nowhere." I checked the bylaws before I moved in. There was nothing against horses. "Well, now there is," she said, her tone as smug as ever. "I suggest you comply before this becomes a bigger issue." Then she turned on her heel and strutted off like she had just delivered some grand decree. Oh, I wasn't going down without a fight. Karren had no idea who she was messing with. I wasn't about to let Karren bulldoze me with her bogus new rule. She might have thought she could rewrite the bylaws on a whim, but I knew better. The HOA wasn't some all-powerful entity that could erase legally permitted structures just because the president didn't like them. If she wanted a fight, she had picked the wrong woman. The first thing I did was dig into the new bylaw she claimed had banned my horses. I got my hands on the updated HOA rules, and sure enough, there was a brand new clause stating that livestock and large domesticated animals were no longer permitted within the community. That alone was suspicious. Changes like this required a majority vote from homeowners, and I'd never seen a notice about any such meeting. I started making calls to my neighbors, asking if they had been informed of this change. Not a single one of them had received any notification. That meant Karren had either pushed this rule through without a proper vote or had fabricated the entire thing. I needed undeniable proof, so I went to the county records office. HOAs were required to submit official amendments to their bylaws, and any changes had to be recorded with the local government. After an hour of digging through documents, I confirmed what I suspected: there was no record of a bylaw change. Karren had made the whole thing up. Instead of confronting her immediately, I decided to play it smart. I had a plan, but I needed to set the groundwork first. I installed additional security cameras around my property, ensuring I had full coverage of my stable and the surrounding area. If Karren or any of her lackeys tried anything underhanded, I'd have video evidence. Then, I drafted a formal complaint against her for violating HOA procedures and mailed copies to every homeowner in the neighborhood. I detailed how she had attempted to enforce a non-existent rule and bypassed the required voting process. I also included a copy of the official HOA bylaws, highlighting that no such amendment had been recorded. The neighborhood was buzzing with outrage within days. Homeowners who had tolerated Karren's antics before were now furious at her blatant abuse of power. Several residents started discussing the possibility of voting her out as HOA president. But I wasn't done. I knew Karren wouldn't back down easily, so I prepared for her next move. Sure enough, just a few days later, she showed up at my property again, this time with 2 HOA board members trailing behind her. She pointed at my stable with exaggerated disgust, loudly claiming that I was in violation of community standards. I didn't argue. Instead, I calmly informed her that I had already checked with the county records office and there was no legal amendment banning my horses. The moment I said it, her face twitched. She tried to recover, insisting the HOA had every right to regulate property use, but the board members exchanged uneasy glances. I handed them copies of my findings, showing that Karren had fabricated the so-called rule. The 2 board members, realizing they had been dragged into something shady, quickly excused themselves, claiming they needed to review the documents. Karren, on the other hand, was seething. But I had one more trick up my sleeve. If Karren wanted to play dirty, so could I. With the neighborhood turning against her and her authority crumbling, I decided to give her a personal taste of her own medicine. That night, with the help of a few neighbors who were just as fed up with her as I was, we relocated my horses right into Karren's backyard. It was a quiet operation. Her backyard wasn't fenced off properly, so guiding Jasper and Lady in was easier than I expected. We secured them safely, made sure they had food and water, and then waited. The next morning, Karren's shriek of outrage could probably be heard from the next town over. She stormed out of her house, robe flapping, screaming about wild animals on her property. The best part? She called animal control, thinking they would remove them. But when animal control arrived, they checked my horses' documentation, saw that they were registered and permitted, and informed Karren that they weren't wild animals at all. Since her backyard had no proper fencing, she was technically responsible for any animals that wandered in. The sight of Karren standing there, completely flustered as the officer explained how she would need to file a formal complaint rather than demand immediate removal, was priceless. Meanwhile, the homeowner's outrage reached its peak. With my evidence and Karren's latest public meltdown, a recall vote was scheduled. The neighborhood turned out in force, and in a landslide decision, Karren was stripped of her position as HOA president. Her reign of terror was over, the final cherry on top. The new HOA board not only reinstated my right to keep my horses, but they also implemented new transparency rules to ensure no future president could pull a stunt like Karren's again. Justice had been served, and Jasper and Lady got to stay right where they belonged on my property, safe and sound. With Karren stripped of her power and my horses secured on my property, I thought the nightmare was over. But people like Karren never go down without a final act of desperation. A few weeks after the recall vote, I noticed an unusual car parked near my property in the early evening. It was an older model sedan, dark blue, with tinted windows. At first, I brushed it off as someone visiting a neighbor, but when I saw the same car parked there 3 nights in a row, I knew something was off. I wasn't about to let anyone intimidate me, so I did what any reasonable person would do. I installed a few extra motion-activated floodlights and adjusted my security cameras to cover a wider area. If someone was watching me, I wanted to catch them in the act. The next morning, I got my answer. My neighbor, Marcus, an ex-Marine who ran a local security company, knocked on my door holding a flash drive. He had his own set of cameras with night vision, and he'd caught footage of someone sneaking around my property the night before. We reviewed the footage together. The grainy black and white video showed a figure dressed in dark clothes creeping toward my stable just after midnight. They fiddled with the latch on the gate, but my reinforced lock held firm. When they couldn't get in, they moved toward my house, lingering near my back patio before retreating into the darkness. Marcus leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. "That wasn't some random trespasser," he said. "They knew where to go, they were looking for something specific." I had a sinking feeling I already knew who was behind it. Karren had been humiliated when she was voted out, and someone like her didn't take that kind of loss lightly, but I needed proof before I made any accusations. That evening, I took a calculated risk. I left my stable unlocked, but I rigged a secondary security system inside. Motion sensors were linked to an alert on my phone, and I placed a GPS tracker on both Jasper and Lady's halters just in case someone tried to move them. At 2 in the morning, my phone vibrated. The motion sensors had been triggered. I jumped out of bed and checked the live feed on my security app. A figure was inside my stable, moving toward Jasper's stall. I grabbed my flashlight, my phone, and a sturdy wooden bat before slipping out the back door. As I approached the stable, I could hear someone whispering harshly, trying to coax Jasper out. I flicked on my flashlight, the beam landing directly on the intruder. It was one of Karren's closest allies on the old HOA board, Stuart, a retired accountant with a superiority complex. He flinched as the light blinded him, his hand still gripping Jasper's halter. I didn't give him a chance to explain. I pulled out my phone and started recording. "Care to explain why you're trespassing on my property in the middle of the night?" He stammered, releasing Jasper and raising his hands. "This isn't what it looks like. It looks like you were trying to steal my horse." "Steal? No, I was just—" He cut himself off, realizing there was no way to spin what he was doing. "Look, I was just checking to see if they were being properly cared for." I laughed at the audacity. "You expect me to believe that? You broke into my stable in the dead of night because you were concerned about animal welfare." He shifted uncomfortably. "You don't understand. Karren," I held up a hand. "That's all I needed to hear." I immediately called the sheriff's department. Stuart tried to plead with me, insisting it was all a misunderstanding, but I ignored him. By the time the deputies arrived, he was sweating bullets. After reviewing the security footage and listening to my statement, the officers placed Stuart under arrest for trespassing and attempted theft. As they cuffed him, he kept muttering about how he was just following orders. That phrase stuck with me. The next day, I decided to pay Karren a visit. I wasn't about to let her orchestrate this nonsense from the shadows. When I knocked on her door, she answered with a look of forced politeness, as if she hadn't spent the past month pretending I didn't exist. "Danielle," she said, her tone dripping with fake civility. "What brings you here?" I didn't bother with pleasantries. "Stuart got arrested last night trying to steal my horse." "He mentioned you." Her expression didn't change, but I saw the flicker of panic in her eyes. "I have no idea what you're talking about." I pulled out my phone and pressed play on the video I had taken of Stuart's confession. "You sure about that?" She watched in silence, her jaw tightening. When the clip ended, she exhaled sharply. "This is ridiculous. I had nothing to do with it." I tucked my phone away. "The sheriff's department might be interested in hearing otherwise." Her mask cracked. "You wouldn't." I tilted my head. "After everything you've done." "Oh, I absolutely would." She crossed her arms, trying to regain control of the conversation. "Fine. Maybe I told Stuart that someone needed to do something about your situation, but I never told him to break in. That's still conspiracy to commit a crime." Her face paled. "You can't prove that," I shrugged. "Maybe not today, but I have a feeling Stuart won't take the fall for you. When he starts talking, your little scheme will unravel." For the first time, Karren looked truly afraid. I let the silence stretch between us before delivering my final blow. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to stay out of my business. No more games, no more sending people after me. Because if you don't, I'll make sure every homeowner in this neighborhood knows exactly what kind of person you are. And if that's not enough, I'll let the police handle the rest." She swallowed hard, her confidence completely shattered. I didn't wait for a response. I turned and walked away, leaving her standing in her doorway, her perfect little world crumbling around her. The fallout was swift. Stuart, desperate to save himself, confessed everything. He admitted that Karren had pressured him into harassing me, hoping I'd give up and move out. With his testimony and my security footage, Karren was officially blacklisted from any future HOA involvement. The new board issued a public statement condemning her actions, and the sheriff's department kept a close eye on her. She stopped showing her face at neighborhood events, and before long, she put her house up for sale. By the time she moved out, the neighborhood had completely turned against her. As for me, I finally got to enjoy my property in peace. Jasper and Lady remained exactly where they belonged, and I made sure my security systems were always up to date, just in case another HOA tyrant ever decided to test me. But something told me that after what happened to Karren, no one in this neighborhood would dare try again. With Karren gone, the neighborhood finally felt like it could breathe again. The oppressive atmosphere she had cultivated for years disappeared almost overnight. People who used to avoid each other started chatting on sidewalks. Kids played freely without fear of some ridiculous HOA complaint. And best of all, my horses could graze in peace without anyone lurking around trying to cause trouble. The new HOA board was competent and fair, a refreshing change from the dictatorship we had endured. They made it clear that they wanted to rebuild trust with the residents, and true to their word, they held open meetings where everyone could voice concerns. I attended the first one out of curiosity, and what I saw was nothing short of a revolution. Homeowners who had kept quiet under Karren's rule suddenly found their voices. One by one, they brought up grievances, unjust fines, fabricated violations, and even instances where Karren had manipulated financial records to funnel HOA funds into miscellaneous expenses that had never been accounted for. By the time the meeting ended, the new board had formed an audit committee to investigate the HOA's finances, and it became clear that Karren's misdeeds went much deeper than anyone had realized. I didn't expect to hear Karren's name again after that, but trouble has a way of lingering, even after you think it's gone. A few weeks after she moved out, I received a letter in the mail with no return address. Inside was a typed note, short and to the point. "You think you've won, but you haven't. I will be back and you'll regret everything." It wasn't signed, but I didn't need a signature to know exactly who had sent it. I had dealt with people like Karren before, power-hungry, manipulative, and incapable of letting go of control. She had lost everything, and instead of accepting defeat, she was stewing in her own bitterness, waiting for an opportunity to strike back. I wasn't about to let her intimidate me. I took the letter straight to the sheriff's office, where they added it to the growing file on her misconduct. The deputy I spoke to assured me that if Karren tried anything, there would be legal consequences. Still, I wasn't about to sit around waiting for her next move. I doubled down on security at my property, upgrading my camera systems and reinforcing my stable with additional locks. Marcus, my veteran neighbor, helped me install motion-sensitive floodlights that covered every inch of my land. If anyone tried to sneak onto my property again, they wouldn't get far without being caught on multiple angles of footage. For a while, nothing happened. Life settled into a peaceful routine, and I started to believe that maybe Karren had finally given up. Then one night, I heard Jasper and Lady stomping restlessly in their stalls. Horses are naturally alert animals, and when they sense something off, they react. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside, my breath visible in the cool night air. The stable doors were secure, but Jasper kept tossing his head, his ears flicking toward the tree line at the back of my property. I scanned the area with my flashlight, and that's when I saw a shadowy figure just beyond my fence line standing perfectly still. Whoever it was, they weren't expecting to be seen. The moment my light landed on them, they turned and bolted into the darkness. I didn't chase them. I didn't have to. My cameras had already captured everything. The next morning, I reviewed the footage with Marcus. The figure had approached from the far side of my property, staying low and moving cautiously as if they were trying to avoid detection. But they had miscalculated. The upgraded cameras had caught them from multiple angles, and when we zoomed in, the grainy footage revealed something unmistakable. A flash of blonde hair and the distinct outline of a face I had hoped never to see again. Karren, she had come back. I wasted no time. I handed the footage over to the sheriff's department, and this time they weren't just taking notes, they were taking action. Trespassing, harassment, and now a documented pattern of intimidation. That was enough for a restraining order. Karren was served with legal papers the very next day. I half expected another angry letter, but instead, she went silent. Maybe she finally realized that she had lost, that no amount of scheming would change the fact that she was no longer in control. A few weeks later, word got around that she had left town entirely. Some said she had moved to another HOA-run neighborhood, hoping to regain power elsewhere. Others speculated that she had fled to avoid further legal trouble after the HOA audit uncovered thousands of dollars in unaccounted-for funds. Whatever the truth was, I didn't care. She was gone. And this time, she wasn't coming back. With Karren gone for good, the neighborhood finally felt like it had reclaimed its soul. People who had once tiptoed around in fear of arbitrary fines and nonsense rules were now enjoying their homes the way they were meant to. The HOA board, under its new leadership, actually listened to the residents instead of dictating their every move. Barbecues returned, kids played freely, and best of all, no one was lurking around looking for ways to make life miserable. I was finally able to focus on my horses without worrying about sabotage. Jasper and Lady settled into their routines, their stress melting away now that they weren't being targeted. Even Marcus, my ex-Marine neighbor, mentioned how much more relaxed the entire neighborhood felt without Karren's oppressive presence looming over everyone. But just when I thought I could finally enjoy the peace, another issue started creeping up, one that had been buried under Karren's reign of terror. It started with small murmurs at HOA meetings. Homeowners would bring up concerns about certain expenses that didn't add up, vague charges that had been quietly tacked onto their HOA dues for years. The new board, eager to restore faith in their leadership, had ordered a deep dive into the HOA's finances. What they found was worse than anyone expected. Karren's financial mismanagement wasn't just a case of sloppy bookkeeping, it was outright theft. Under her leadership, tens of thousands of dollars had been funneled into suspicious maintenance costs that had no records of actual work being done. Fake invoices, sketchy payments to shell companies, and outright withdrawals with no explanations had drained the HOA's reserves. The discovery sent shockwaves through the neighborhood. People who had begrudgingly paid their dues now realized they had been funding Karren's personal slush fund. And the worst part, it wasn't just past corruption. Some of these issues were still affecting homeowners. I wasn't directly impacted. Karren had been too busy trying to get rid of my horses to mess with my finances, but I couldn't stand by while my neighbors suffered. Some of them were elderly couples living on fixed incomes, and others were families just scraping by. The last thing they needed was to be told they owed back payments because Karren had bled the HOA dry. The new board had an emergency meeting to discuss options. The legal process to recover stolen funds would take time, but in the short term, they needed to find a way to stabilize the HOA's budget without punishing the homeowners. That's when an idea hit me. I had land, I had horses, and I knew exactly how we could raise money without squeezing the residents for more dues. I proposed opening a small community riding program. Nothing too elaborate, just weekend lessons for kids and a few guided trail rides for families. The HOA could sponsor it, and all proceeds would go directly into replenishing the stolen funds. It would be completely voluntary, and anyone who wanted to contribute could do so while actually getting something in return. The board loved the idea. With their approval, I got to work. Marcus, always ready to lend a hand, helped me build a proper riding arena, and several neighbors volunteered to assist with scheduling and logistics. Within a few weeks, the program was up and running, and the response was overwhelming. Families who had never interacted before started showing up, bonding over shared experiences as their kids learned to ride. Elderly residents who had felt isolated during Karren's reign found joy in simply watching the horses and chatting with neighbors. Even people who had never cared about equestrian activities joined in, eager to contribute to rebuilding the community. The program brought in more money than I had expected. Between donations, lesson fees, and a few generous contributions from residents who had once been hit hardest by Karren's scams, the HOA's financial situation started stabilizing faster than anyone had hoped. The irony of it all wasn't lost on me. Karren had tried to erase my horses from the neighborhood, but in the end, they had become the very thing that saved it. The final twist came when the HOA's legal team managed to track down Karren's fraudulent transactions. With enough evidence to build a solid case, they filed a lawsuit against her, demanding full restitution. The case dragged on for months, but eventually, Karren was forced to pay back every stolen dollar. Her attempt to control and manipulate the neighborhood had ended in complete and utter failure. As for me, I finally had the peace I had fought so hard for. My horses remained exactly where they belonged, my neighbors were thriving, and the community had come together in a way that no one had thought possible. And best of all, Karren would never set foot in this neighborhood again. With Karren permanently out of the picture and the HOA finally under competent leadership, life in the neighborhood settled into its new, harmonious rhythm. The riding program I had started continued to thrive, drawing more families and even some local schools interested in weekend lessons for their students. What had once been a battleground of petty HOA tyranny had transformed into a tight-knit community that actually cared about its residents. But despite the peace, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still unfinished. Karren's downfall had been swift and absolute, but she had left more than just financial damage in her wake. There were still lingering scars, people who had been unfairly fined, homes that had been targeted for unnecessary modifications, and neighbors who had been too afraid to speak up against her corruption. One evening, as I was brushing Jasper down in the stable, Marcus walked up, hands in his pockets. He had been one of my biggest supporters throughout the ordeal, always ready to lend a hand or offer advice when things got tough. He leaned against the fence, watching as Jasper flicked his ears contentedly. "You ever think about what's next?" I glanced at him, raising an eyebrow. "Next for what?" "The neighborhood." "The HOA. We got rid of Karren, but systems like that don't just fix themselves." "Sure, the new board is doing a good job, but how long before someone else comes along and starts pulling the same tricks?" He had a point. Just because we had won this battle didn't mean another power-hungry opportunist wouldn't try to take control in the future. I wiped my hands on my jeans, considering his words. "What are you suggesting?" He tilted his head slightly, the corner of his mouth twitching in amusement. "I think you know exactly what I'm suggesting." It didn't take long for me to realize what he meant. If I really wanted to ensure that this neighborhood never fell into the hands of another Karren, I needed to do more than just sit back and enjoy the victory. I needed to take an active role in keeping things fair. By the next HOA election, I officially ran for a seat on the board. The decision wasn't entirely mine alone. The other homeowners practically pushed me into it. After everything that had happened, they wanted someone they could trust to keep things transparent and fair. And with the way things were shaping up, I realized I wanted that too. The election wasn't even close. The residents still had fresh memories of Karren's reign, and they wanted someone who wouldn't let history repeat itself. By the time the votes were tallied, I had won by an overwhelming majority. Now, instead of fighting the HOA, I was part of it. But this time, things were different. The first order of business was making sure that no one could ever abuse their power the way Karren had. We rewrote several of the old bylaws, adding clear protections for homeowners against arbitrary rule changes. No more secret votes, no more fabricated violations, and definitely no more personal vendettas disguised as regulations. One of the most satisfying moments came when we officially nullified every single bogus fine Karren had ever issued. Some homeowners had been forced to pay ridiculous fees for things as trivial as the color of their curtains or the type of flowers in their front yard. Every dollar that had been wrongfully collected was refunded. The relief on people's faces when they realized they were finally free from her nonsense was worth every bit of effort. At the end of the day, the neighborhood wasn't just healing, it was thriving. The riding program became a staple of the community, with families from outside the neighborhood even coming to participate. What had once been Karren's biggest target ended up being one of the greatest assets to the HOA, not just financially, but in bringing people together. One afternoon, as I was finishing up a lesson with a group of local kids, I noticed Marcus watching from the fence again, arms crossed. He grinned as I approached. "So, Madam Board Member, how's it feel sitting on the other side?" I chuckled, shaking my head. "Different, but at least now I know things are being done the right way." He nodded in approval. "You did good, Danielle. Real good." I glanced back at the stable where Jasper and Lady stood contentedly, their tails flicking lazily in the afternoon sun. The very thing Karren had tried so hard to destroy had not only survived, but had grown stronger than ever. For the first time in a long while, I felt something I hadn't felt since moving here. Peace, and this time I knew it was here to stay.